Begin by hooping up cutaway stabilizer in the hoop and load the design onto your machine. Then place batting 1 on top of the hoop and stitch down. Once stitched down, remove the hoop from your machine and trim the batting 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching, using your applique scissors. Stitch the placement line for the first short half tile at the top left of the block. Place one piece of fabric A right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement line, and stitch down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching. Leave the fabric in the seams untrimmed. Repeat the applique process with the next short half tile at the top right of the block with another piece of fabric A. Trim, leave the fabric in the seams. Repeat the applique process with the long half tile shape on the left side of the block using one piece of fabric B. Trim, leave the fabric in the seams. Repeat the applique process with the tile shape in the center of the block using fabric C. Trim. Repeat the applique process with the long half tile shape on the right side of the block using the remaining piece of fabric B. Trim, leave the fabric in the seams. Repeat the applique process with the short half tile at the bottom left of the block with another piece of fabric A. Trim, leave the fabric in the seams. Repeat the applique process with the short half tile at the bottom right of the block with the remaining piece of fabric A. Trim, leaving the fabric in the seams. Embroider the satin stitches between the short half tiles. Embroider the satin stitches around the long half tiles. Embroider the satin stitch around the full tile in the center. Embroider the motifs on the short half tiles. Embroider the motif in the center. Embroider the jagged star in the center. You have now completed the stitch out of block 5. Remove your work from the hoop and trim the seams to about 1/2 inch using a rotary cutter and ruler. Here you have completed the block. Hold aside and follow the instructions for the remaining blocks you want to make. Awesome job everyone. I will now show you how to turn the blocks into a cushion. First lay your blocks on a flat surface and decide on your layout. Start off by joining the blocks in rows. Take the first 2 blocks and place them right sides together. Pin along one edge, lining up the border stitching the best you can. Take your time with this process. Take the pin blocks over to your sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam, sewing inside the border lines already on the panels, so the stitching won't be seen later. Continue this until you have joined the remaining blocks in that row together. Open the seams and iron them flat. Then continue this until you have each horizontal row of blocks joined. Next, join the horizontal rows to each other by placing the first 2 rows right sides together. Pin along that bottom edge and stitch the seam on your sewing machine. Stitch just inside the border already stitched on the blocks, so the stitching will not be seen on the right side later. Open out the stitched seams and iron flat. Attaching the flat piping. This step is optional. Measure the join blocks, allowing for an inch overlapping each side of the blocks. Cut 4 1.5 inch strips for the flat piping, which is fabric D, with your measured length. Note, the flat piping strip should not have any joins in them, as this will cause them to look uneven when finished. Press the strips of flat fabric for the piping in half widthways, ensuring the raw edges are exactly on top of each other. Lay one of the flat piping strips on top of the bottom edge of the right side of the joined blocks, matching the raw edge of the piping strip with the raw edge of the cushion front, and the folded edge of the piping strip towards the center of the cushion front. Clip together and stitch into place with a 1/4 inch seam. Repeat the process for the remaining sides. Trim the edges of the flat piping so they are even. To find out the side border lengths, fabric E and fabric F. To work out the length of the measurements for the side borders, start by adding 2 widths of the inside and outer borders together. For an example, 1.5 inches plus 3 inches equals 4.5 inches. Now multiply this number by 2. Example, 4.5 inches by 2 equals 9 inches. To work out your final length measurement, measure along one side edge, the longer edge, of the join blocks and add this measurement to the new number. Example, 19 inches plus 9 inches equals 28 inches. This is the length you should cut your side borders. For the end borders, fabric G and fabric H, repeat the same method as above. The widths of the borders are the same as the sides. To work out your final length measurement, measure along one end edge of the join blocks and add this measurement to the new number. Example, 13 inches plus 9 inches equals 22 inches. This is the length you should cut your end borders. Attach the inside borders to their matching outer border. Do this by placing the inside and outside borders right sides together. Pin and stitch together along one of the long edges with a 1/4 inch seam. Fold over and iron the seam open. Repeat this process for the remaining borders. Cut 2 strips of batting, batting 2 and batting 3 to match each sewn together border. Next we are going to secure the batting to the border fabric. This can be done in 2 ways. The first option is to place the border fabric right side up on top of the batting and with a long basting stitch, sew a 1/4 inch from the edge. Basting the long edges together will prevent them from moving. Use a bobbin thread that will stand out for this step. The second option is to lightly spray temporary adhesive to the batting and then lay your fabric right side up on the batting. We chose the second option. Side borders. Fold one of the end borders right sides together, short edge to short edge. Mark the fold with a pin on the inside border edge, and then unfold. Place the cushion on top of the side border with the attached batting. Have them right sides together and make sure the raw edge of the cushion is matching up with the raw edge of the inside border strip. Also, match up the center pins together that we marked earlier. Pin together. We now need to stitch them together. The trick with stitching the borders on is that you don't want to sew into the seams, as they can later create pleats in the fabric or the mitered border. Just won't turn out right. To begin, sink your needle right into the corner stitching, but still in between those two stitching lines, and begin stitching. Finish the stitching in the opposite corner, and remember, do not stitch into the seam. Now for the end borders. Place your cushion right side up on your work surface. Fold the excess fabric from the side borders up against the stitching and out of the way. Pin them in place so they don't move back. When folded back, you will notice that the stitching doesn't go into the seams. You do not need to fold the cushion in half to find the center, as you can use the seam in between the two blocks as the center point. Fold one of the end borders short, right sides together, short edge to short edge. Mark the fold with the pin on the inside border edge. Unfold. Place the cushion on top of the end border with the attached batting. Have them right sides together and make sure the raw edge of the cushion is matching up with the raw edge inside the border strip. Also, match up the center pins together that we marked earlier. Pin together. Stitch together. Again, make sure that we do not stitch into the seams on the blocks. Sink your needle right into the corner stitching, but still in between those two stitching lines. You can sink the needle down right at the end of the side border stitching so they meet up. If you use spray adhesive, you will not have stitching the whole length of your border. You will need to draw a line on both ends of the border and then use these lines as a trimming guide to remove the batting from the seam allowance. Simply just match a ruler up with the stitching you have just done and use a pen to make the marking. Trim back the batting from the seam allowance, being careful not to cut any of the stitching. Fold over and iron the side border down neatly. Creating the mitered border corners. Have your cushion right side facing up on your work surface. Fold an end border on top of the side border, right sides together. Try and match up the borders perfectly. Pin these two borders together. This will keep them in place from moving while stitching. Make sure you have the little corner seam from the blocks flipped open and flat. With a ruler against the folded edge, mark a line for the corner point of stitching and across the border fabric and batting. If you have a striped border, place some pins along this marked line for matching up the stripe when stitching. The stitching of a mitered corner sometimes requires a couple of attempts to get it absolutely correct and sitting flat. Stitch from the corner point of the stitching right along the marked line and finishing the stitching on the outer edges of the borders. Unfold the cushion and check to see that the mitered corner has worked. Repeat the same process for the remaining 3 corners. If you use batting, fold over again and trim the excess batting from the ends of the borders. Trim back the seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Repeat the same process for the remaining 3 corners. Trim the edges of the cushion to ensure that they are all even and the same width. Iron the seam open. Place your cushion lining fabric eye wrong side up on top of your work surface. Then place the cushion you have just made right side up on top of the lining fabric, wrong sides together. Lightly spray your lining down to your cushion. Alternatively, edge base all the edges around the cushion, sandwiching all layers using a 1/4 inch seam with a long stitch. This just helps keep everything in place when attaching the binding. Once this is done, trim the excess backing fabric so it matches the exact same shape of the cushion. Preparing the envelope backing. Take out pieces fabric J and fabric K. Starting with fabric J, fold one of the long edges 1/2 inch wrong sides together, press with the iron. Then fold over a second time another 1/2 inch, press with the iron. Stitch along the folded edge to hold it in place. Repeat the same steps with fabric K piece. Adding the backing to the cushion. Have your cushion front wrong side facing up. Take one of the backing pieces fabric J and place it wrong side up on the back of the cushion. Have the folded edge of fabric J in line with the seam between the second and third rows. Next, we need to measure out and mark the placement for fabric K piece. Measure 2.5 inches in from the folded edge of fabric K. We drew a line across indicating this 2.5 inch mark with a chalk pen. Then place your remaining backing piece fabric K on top of the opposite side of the cushion front right side up, with the folded edge of your fabric K piece in line with the mark you made on the fabric J piece. The 2 backing pieces should form an envelope, with the hem sides overlapping each other. The backing pieces will be larger, but this excess fabric will be trimmed away later on. Pin the 2 backing pieces in place. Then turn the whole cushion over to the other side so that the wrong sides of the blocks are facing upwards. The backing pieces should not fall off as you have pinned it. Stitching from the back of the borders, stitch together with a 1/2 inch seam all the way around the cushion, being careful not to get the machine foot caught on the folds of the backing. Trim the backing fabric so it matches and is in line with the cushion front. Use your own preferred way of adding the binding to the outer edges of your cushion or follow our method of making a binding with fabric L. To make the binding, measure the length and width of the cushion and add them together and multiply by 2. Cut a long strip of fabric this length. If you're cutting one piece of fabric this length, add about an extra 12 to 16 inches or 30 to 40 centimeters to the length, just to be sure you have enough fabric in the end. Or cut a few strips and join them together with your sewing machine as shown. Add extra length if you're joining the strips, about 10 centimeters or 4 inches per strip. The width is optional, but we usually find 3 inches or 8 centimeters wide sufficient. Lay the ends of your fabric strips right sides together at a right angle. Pin the two pieces of fabric together, keeping the edges matching. Draw a 45-degree angle with the fabric marker. Then sew a diagonal seam from corner to corner. Cut the corner a 1/4 of an inch from the stitch down. Now iron open the seam. And repeat until all the binding strips are sewn together into one long strip. Then fold the whole strip in half, wrong sides together, and iron down. Lay out your binding fabric and unfold one end. Fold that open end of the binding to a 45-degree angle and lightly press. Trim your fabric a 1/4 of an inch from the 45-degree angle fold. Fold the binding strip in half again. Match the raw edges of the cushion and the binding to the desired starting location with your cushion right side up. Start about halfway along one side. Using a ruler, mark 1 inch down from the end of the strip. Mark with a pin. Using a ruler, mark 3 inches down from the 1 inch mark. Mark with a second pin. At this time, we also marked a 2-inch gap above from the first pin. This pin will signal when to stop stitching once we have sewn around the cushion. Using a 3/8 of an inch seam, stitch 1 inch of the open fold onto the cushion and stop stitching when you get to the 1 inch mark. Then leave a 3-inch gap. This will provide an opening to insert the end of the binding fabric when we have completed the sewing. Then start stitching again at the 3-inch mark. Continue sewing until you reach the first corner and stop stitching 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the end, but keep your needle down. Lift your foot and turn your cushion with your needle still down. Continue stitching to the corner. Lift the binding strip over and pull against the angled stitch that we just made to form a diagonal fold. Then fold the binding strip back down, creating a fold at the top. Pin and start stitching again until you reach the side of the cushion that you started on, mitering the corners as you go. Stop stitching when you get to the pin that marks the 2 inches from the starting point. Fold up the remaining binding so it sits just above the first 3-inch mark. Trim the excess binding, leaving enough to slip into the fold. Trim 1/8 of an inch or 2 to 3 centimeters off the raw edge of the binding for a good 1 inch. Place the end of the binding fabric into the pocket created at the start of the binding process. Pin in place. Continue to stitch the seam until binding is completely sewn on. Fold back the binding and iron the seams flat. Now turn the cushion over so you're working on the back of the cushion. We started at the corners of the cushion. Fold in one side of the corner just past the stitching and iron well. Pin in place. This will help get a nice pointed corner. Repeat for the other side of the corner, meeting up with the first fold, creating a nice pointed corner. Repeat for all 4 corners of the cushion, then continue folding and pinning the remaining binding to the back of the cushion just past the stitching. Start stitching anywhere on the cushion from the front using the stitch and the ditch method. When you get to the corner, simply just leave your needle down and lift the foot and rotate the cushion. Put your foot down and continue stitching in this fashion until you're right around the cushion. This next step is optional. Add some sort of closure to the back of the cushion if you feel it's necessary. We added cam snaps to the back of our cushion. To do this, simply measure along the seam, decide how many cam snaps you need and spread them equally. To finish off, give it a good press with the iron. Insert a cushion insert or stuff with stuffing. Great work, guys. Enjoy your beautiful cushion. Thank you to everyone that tuned into this month's sew along tutorial. I hope you enjoy making your very own Moroccan cushion. Remember to share your wonderful projects on the Sew Along Facebook group, and let's share the love. If you enjoyed this video tutorial, remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you again for next month's Sew Along. Happy crafting!